So we're down to the last steps. You can see that I've gone through 120, 220, 320 by hand. Now you might ask, well, you did the 120 by the orbital sander, why go 120 again? And the reason for that is the orbital sander will put in some swirls across the grain, and I want to go with the grain up and down along the boat to take those out with the 120. The other thing is the orbital or the belt sander, if you chose to use that, will flatten out your gunnel across the top, take that round over a little bit out of it. So the 120, I can actually, let it curve over the gunnel and get that round over back again. So it takes out those swirls and it rounds over the gunnel for me. Front to back, or end to end of the boat with the 120, underneath the in-whale, and then on top. And then same thing with 220. You might feel at that point that, it's pretty darn smooth, it's ready for finish with the 220. Do persist with the 320. You want it to be slippery smooth. The 220 feels really nice and smooth, but that 320 takes it to a next level. And that will allow the oil to sit on there really well and penetrate into the wood and build up a nice glossy finish. It's just that much more satisfying when you apply oil to a a 320 or a 400 grit finish as opposed to a 220 grit finish. So what I'm going to do now is clean up the boat, take a rag to it, get all the dust off, vacuum it out, and then I'm ready to apply the tongue oil. Okay, so I've got the boat all cleaned up, vacuumed it out. It's ready for the final coat, which is the oil. What I'm going to use is a tongue oil, and this is the one that I use right here. It's Minwax. Oh, got that in French there. Tongue oil, Minwax. It's available at Canadian Tire, Home Depot, you name it. So I like this one because it dries well. There are tongue oils out there without dryers, and they're a lot nicer to breathe the fumes. They don't give me a headache, but they don't dry very well. So I do use this one, and I wear a respirator and gloves when I do use it. I'm just going to apply it with a rag. So clean cotton rag. And all I'm going to do is put some on the rag and then wipe it on the canoe. And fairly liberally apply it. You don't have to go crazy. You want to do, some light, thin coats, but get it soaked in to all the screw holes underneath the gunnels particularly. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to flip the boat and get it nice and tight on the bottom of where the gunnel meets the hull and make sure that's well sealed, because as you saw earlier, that's the part that really gets a lot of weathering. I'm going to do this in about 6 coats. Sounds like a lot. It'll dry. You can do about 3-4 coats a day if you're working away at it. So I'm going to do this over the next few days and just build up a nice sheen on the gunnels. Something happens that's kind of magical around the 5th or 6th coat of tongue oil. It gets really glossy, really well protected, almost like a varnish, and it's kind of a really good waterproof finish, very smooth, and it looks great. So the boat is dried overnight now, and I'm ready to resand and put on a second coat of oil. It's starting to look really good. You're going to feel a bit of grit. The oil will pick up some dust in the air, and so for that reason we want to do a light sand in between. Sometimes I just rub it with my hands, but what I've taken to lately is using some really fine sandpaper. This is 1,000 grit. You can use 400, or if you have 600 or 800, that's great. But I'm gonna do this because I have it around, and it just makes it super smooth and slick, and the oil really applies really nicely after that. So I'm gonna go and sand. Just a really super quick light sand, and then I apply another coat. Meanwhile, I've got the yoke and thwart and seats and all the seat trusses and grab handles out here. I'm going to give them the same kind of treatment. I'm going to go over them with 120 grit. They're not in too bad condition. If they were really rough and gray, then yeah, I want to start with the 60. And get that all off, and then work up through my successive grits of paper up to 320 again. But I'm going to start with 120 because they're not in too bad condition, and then I'll go to 220, 320, and give them a coat of oil as well. I like oil, and you might say, well, I see a lot of yokes particularly, and seats and those parts all varnished. The reason I don't varnish is that what happens is varnish is a coating that sits on top of the surface rather than penetrates the surface of the wood. And then what happens over time is that water can tend to get underneath that coating, and you'll see that the varnish starts to flake and everything kind of gets gray and it starts to dry rot underneath that surface. Whereas oil actually penetrates the surface of the wood, and redoing oil is a really simple fix. You just give it a light sand and add more. Whereas if I'm redoing varnish, I've got to really sand the whole thing super well and then do a few coats and hang them, and it's a bit of a process, and I do that with paddles to get them super well sealed. But I just prefer the oil on the canoe parts than I do to varnish. And same thing with the gunwale, because they do take so much beating. The varnish just tends to chip off. So I use the tongue oil on almost, pretty much all canoe parts. But I'll go and do those and get that all cleaned up as well. And probably 2 or 3 coats of oil on top of a light sand will do it with these. Could I go the 6 coats? Sure, would make it beautiful, but I think 2 or 3 coats it's going to start to really shine up because they're already well protected and not in too bad condition right now. Everything's sanded, ready to go. I sanded up to 320 on this. They're super smooth. Big tip of the day for oiling, it's basically the same procedure. Use your tongue oil, get your cloth. But what I'm going to recommend is pour it into a container, and that way you can dip your cloth and wipe it on. And secondly, what you can do, and this is important for the parts, is actually dip the ends of these parts into the oil and let it really suck up. If you think about a piece of wood, the grain is running across this way. It's kind of like a whole bunch of straws all running that way, and when they get dipped into the oil, it gets sucked right up into that end grain. And those are the areas that start to rot out first because they don't get enough protection, they don't get sealed properly. Often when canoe builders put a boat together, they're over length, they cut them, install them, and there's no protection on those ends. And you'll see that often on the ends of your seats, where those holes that have been drilled through for the seat trusses or hangers, they start to rot out there and the seats just fall apart. So get them dipped right in, get your yoke ends dipped right in, your thwart, your grab handles, your seat, the butt ends, and let the oil really soak up into that end grain. And 2 or 3 coats like that, and you're going to do your canoe well. It's going to last a lot longer, your wood components. Other than that, wipe it on, let it dry overnight for a couple hours, whatever. Give it a buff, and then do it again, 2 or 3 coats. You can buff it with a rag. Like I said, I went with a 1000 grit sandpaper because I had it. Made it pretty silky smooth, I must say. But often what I'll do is I'll just use the rag from yesterday because it dried up, and when I'm putting that rag away, just safety wise, lay it out wide, don't bunch it up and throw it in a corner. It can actually generate heat and create a fire. Crazy. But the oil does that. As it dries, it exotherms and those rags actually I've seen catch fire, and people do burn their workshops down that way. Crazy, but it happens. So lay it out flat on a surface, let it dry, let it evaporate off and not generate all that heat. The nice thing about that is the next day it's actually dry and kind of crunchy, and it's got a bit of an abrasive to it. It's kind of like a 400 grit sandpaper. And I often use that rag and I rub the gunnels and rub the parts with that dry crispy rag, and it buffs it really nicely for me. You want to try and generate a little heat to drive the oil into the wood, right into the pores. So rubbing pretty aggressively, and then add your next coats. Really forgiving stuff oil, because you don't have to worry about dust and all that kind of stuff that you have to with varnish. And later on throughout the season, if you notice you got a little scraper and nick or whatever, you just give it a little light sand and add a little piece of oil, a little bit of oil just in that spot. That's another reason why I really like oil on canoe parts. There she is, all done. Nice and polished up and shiny. You can see that all the woodwork is nice and coated. It's got a nice sheen to it. You can see how something just kind of magical happened around the 5th or 6th coat of oil once it went on. It almost becomes a varnish, but a very easily repairable varnish, which is what I really like about it. Now that might have seemed like quite a job, but I think it's really worth it. Ash is getting harder and harder to find in long lengths. The emerald ash borer has decimated our forests. I won't get into that, but what the short of it is that even my costs on ash has pretty much tripled in the last couple of years if I can find, 17, 18 foot lengths at all. It's really, really tricky to even source. So it's really worth keeping your gunnels in good shape. Spending an afternoon or a weekend, whatever it takes to sand and re-oil and get them into ship shape again is really worth doing. So I hope this video helps, and hope we can see people on the water in the next few months, whatever it is, coming days. Okay, thanks.